In the same month that 100,000 people died in Hiroshima, the first audiences were queuing to see a controversial new play by J.B. Priestley, An Inspector Calls.
J.B. Priestley is now often handed down to us historically as a sort of rather genial, pipe-smoking traditionalist, whereas in fact in a lot of his work he was very much a radical. A lot of the theatre work is, for its time, incredibly extraordinary and experimental, and a lot of his writings and original prefaces to the play talk about a dream landscape.
Now an extraordinary production of the play is taking modern audiences by storm.
It's a bit like a great old masterpiece. What one's trying to do to a play like this is take away a lot of the grime and the dirt that have accumulated over the years and try to see the sharp, bright colours underneath.
Some people say war is inevitable. To that I say,
Fiddlesticks!
Nobody wants war except some half-civilized folks in the Balkans.
Yes, I know.
To understand An Inspector Calls, we need to look at two periods of British history. 1912, when the play is set, and 1945, when the play was written.
Let's say 1940 or 45, we'll be living in a world that forgot all this capital versus labour agitations, not all these silly little war scares. There'll be peace, prosperity, and rapid progress everywhere.
1945 was the last year of the Second World War. During the war, Priestley had become well known to the British public through his morale-boosting radio broadcast that followed the BBC News every Sunday night.
And I asked myself earnestly, if the kindness of Britain is overshadowed by that vast, dark face, then we all might as well decide to leave this world, for it will not be a world worth living in.
He felt that his writing was something he did in order to forward the war effort. But more than that, it was to try and ensure that the life after the war was better than it had been before. He was echoing the feelings of ordinary people, that there was generally a feeling of the need for change.
When the homeland is in danger and there's trouble in the air, we forget our little squabbles and its trespassers beware. All the nation is united when the danger looms in sight, and we march along together as we sing with all our might.
United we shall stand, whatever may befall, the richest in the land, the poorest of us all. We must all sing together, birds of a feather, and the crowds will soon roll by.
The war dramatically altered the social face of Britain in many ways. The need for arms created full employment, and the morale and welfare of the workers became a national priority. The evacuation of children mixed classes together, and for the first time showed people how the other half lived. The classes were also mixed together in the armed forces. Uniforms and clothes rationing meant everybody looked the same. People were given a vision of how a truly socialist Britain might be, if Britain could survive.
Now they're going into the public shelters. This is not a pleasant way to spend the night, but the people accept it as their part in the defense of London.
Britain did survive. The war was over. But what should Britain do now? Priestley caught the mood in his famous radio broadcast, Journey into Daylight.
We lived at last in a community with a noble common purpose. We had a glimpse then of what life might be if men and women freely dedicated themselves not to their appetites and prejudices, their vanities and fears, but to some great communal task.
Immediately after the war, there was a general election. Winston Churchill, the hero of the war, expected to win, but he underestimated the desperate need for change in the war-battered population. People wanted a new Britain. The Labour candidate, Clement Attlee, won a landslide victory and moved into number 10.
Sir, an inspector's
Does he want to see me?
Yes, sir. Says it's important.
Oh, all right, then, just show him in here. Give us some more light.
Priestley set his play in 1912 because that era represented the very opposite of what people were hoping for in 1945.
2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She was taken in this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course.
Yes, yes, horrible business, but I don't understand why you've come here.
The play is about, do we return back to the values of an Edwardian era, or do we move forward? The actual night that the play is set on is the night that the Titanic sunk, the great celebratory moment of the great dream which was about to collapse.
I remember it quite clearly now. You're a lively, good-looking girl. Country bred, I fancy. Been working in one of my machine shops for over a year. Good worker, too. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But when they came back from their holidays that August, they were all rather restless. And they suddenly decided to ask for more money. Well, they're averaging 22 and 6 a week, which is neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. They wanted the rate raised, so they would average about 25 shillings a week.
8 million people were living on incomes of less than 25 shillings. That's £1.25 a week. Millions were underhoused, underfed and under the thumb. Working women were at the bottom of the pile.
Goods were churning out of the factories, and we were so successful. And we were successful because we kept, as he says in the play, the prices high, but the wages were kept low.
So they all went out on strike. Didn't last long, of course.
Not if it was just after the holidays. They'd be all broke if I know them.
Quite right, Gerald. They mostly were. So was the strike after a few weeks. Pitiful affair.
Mr. Burling's complacency was misplaced. The labour force was on the move and finding its voice. On March the 1st, 1912, 1 million miners went on strike. At the time, the most complete industrial stoppage in British history.
Gerald Croft is an aristocrat. The idea of labour, strikes, the growth of the working class is an appalling idea. I think he finds it completely outrageous that there is such a movement existing.
Britain was divided and ruled by class. The upper class, they owned most of Britain and earned most of the money. The working class, the Eva Smiths, paid the price.
Eva Smith. She was one of them. She'd had a lot to say, far too much. So she had to go.
You couldn't have done anything else.
He could. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck.
Rubbish! If you don't come down sharp on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth.
I should say so.
They might, but after all, it's better to ask for the earth
than to take it!
Edna represents the underdog. She has to obey the Burlings. She has to agree with them. She must never question what they say or do, because they are her bread and butter. It's not easy to get a job, particularly at her age, and if she didn't get another job, it would be the workhouse. And the workhouse in those days was a desperate place.
Some writers were concerned about the way people were living and the appalling social conditions at the time.
But you three youngsters just remember what I tell you now. We can't let these Bernard Shaws and these H.G. Wellses do all the talking.
For the vast majority, there was little education and little or no sanitation, no dole to fall back on, and no National Health Service to rely on. In Edwardian Britain, the two worlds of rich and poor rarely met.
I went to the manager at Millwoods and I told him that if he didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again. And I persuaded Mother to close our account with them.
And why did you do that?
Because I was in a furious temper.
And what had this girl done to make you lose your temper?
When I was looking at myself in the mirror, I caught sight of her smiling at the assistant. I was furious with her.
I think that she spends a great deal of time in and out of dress shops, making herself look presentable to get the right husband. She wouldn't have learned any other skills or anything, so it's just about being a wife, really. And that's what she's about to do, until the inspector turns up.
And so you used the power you had as the daughter of a good customer and also of a man well known in the town to punish the girl just because she made you feel like that?
Yes, but it didn't seem to be anything very terrible at the time. Don't you understand? It's the only time I have ever done anything like that. And I'll never do it again. To anyone.
The best thing about her is her curiosity. She wants to learn and know more, which is her saving grace, really.
For women like Sheila, the route to a good life lay in marrying the right man. Outside the home, however, women were powerless. They couldn't vote. Emily Pankhurst began to change all that in 1903 with the suffragette movement. Through a campaign of sustained civil disobedience, hunger strikes and demonstrations, suffragettes fought vehemently for the right to vote. In 1913, one suffragette was killed throwing herself under the King's horse at Ascot. Sheila Burling wouldn't have been a suffragette before the inspector called, but after, she might well have taken up the banner, much to her mother's disgust.
Mrs. Burling, you're a prominent member of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, aren't you?
She thinks she does good, sitting on this committee. She's a do-gooder, you know, in her head.
And naturally that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case.
I should think so too, damned impudence!
You admit to being prejudiced against her case?
Oh, yes, yes.
Like, there's nothing wrong with being prejudiced against this. Yes, yes. And the daughter, my daughter says...
Look, she's just died a horrible death, Mother. Well, I'm very sorry. But I think she had only herself to blame.
Was it owing to your influence as the most prominent member of the committee that help was refused the girl?
Possibly.
Was it or was it
Yes, it was. I didn't like her manner.
The philanthropic charity groups barely scratched the surface of the problem and merely served to ease the consciences of the privileged few. Any measure which really addressed the problem, a few shillings a week more for Eva Smith, would horrify them.
You have no power to make me change my mind.
Yes, I have.
No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you've done something terribly wrong, and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen...
Please! I've imagined it enough already.
Then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child.
No!
Eva Smith took her own life rather than face the only avenue left open to her. With no social safety net, many women were driven into prostitution. For Eric, women like Eva were only good for entertainment. For upper class and lower class to marry each other would have been scandalous. Had he married her, polite society would have been outraged.
Look, I wasn't in love with her or anything, but I liked her. She was pretty and a good sport.
So you had to go to bed with her?
He knows that sort of judgment day is coming, and he has to come back and confess to what he's done.
Remember what you did, Mrs. Burling. You turned her away when she needed help most. You refused her even the pitiable little bit of organized charity you had in your power to grant her. Remember what you did.
My God, I'm not likely to forget.
Just used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening as if she was a thing, an animal, not a person. No, you won't forget.
I know. I hadn't turned out of a job. I started it.
You helped. But you didn't start it. You started it. She wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and 6. You made her pay a heavy price for that. And now she'll make you pay a heavier price still.
In a sense, it's an idealistic play. It says, if people were able to do their best and lead the best lives, things would be much richer in a deeper sense for everybody than, for instance, just grubbling for money. And so that's why the play, in a sense, is always relevant. He was, in some way, the conscience of the nation.
We don't live alone. We are members of one society. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you, the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish.
In 1914, Edwardian Britain was shattered forever by the First World War.
Sheila will be working in the hospital, she'll be working in the factory, she'll be doing everything she could to support the war effort. She'll definitely roll up her sleeves and get right down there and muck in.
I think he'd die really sort of stupidly and embarrassing. He'd skewer himself or die of food poisoning or something like that in his own trench.
I think Gerald would have had a very comfortable post, many miles from the trenches, moving things about on a board and not getting his hands too dirty.
Yes, I see.
I think Gerald could change, but he doesn't. He's betraying his whole class if he changes.
No girl has died in there today. They haven't had a suicide for months.
Which is why he finds every reason he can why the inspector is a fake.
Sheila, at the very end of the play, she's desperate for change and she wants everyone else to change with her. I do find the play optimistic. You know, she's now going to take responsibility for her position in society, which is pretty good news.
I don't think he's learned anything. The young win, there's no question about that, and the old lose.
It was the police. The girl has just died on the way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant. The police inspector's on his way here to ask some questions.
The question for the first audiences in 1945, as they left the theatre, was what sort of world would they go out and build? Priestley gave them the answer.
We had a glimpse then of what life might be if men and women freely dedicated themselves not to their appetites and prejudices, their vanities and fears, but to some great communal task.